period. We had visits to media managers, editors, editorial boards, and so on across the country to ask for their support and engagement with the process. Through that process, we tried to have a constant stream of news and information related to access to information on radio, television, and in newspapers. We persuaded many newspapers and news magazines to serialize the text of the bill to make the text more widely available to the population. Did training for journalists, especially political correspondents and political editors, so that they could engage with politicians or public officials in the course of any interview. It didn't matter what the interview was about. Access to information would generally come up, and politicians would be required to state their position on the issue and whether they supported the bill or not. And we solicited editorial comments from newspapers and news magazines. And I think this issue got more editorial comments in the country than any other issue. That's how topical it was. Of course, there was a lot of newspaper articles, opinion articles, feature articles around the issue, discussion programs on radio and television. We produced documentaries on freedom of information for radio and television. Also produced a lot of jingles that were also aired on radio and television. We did training for information officers in government institutions at different levels, at the national level and at local levels, to create awareness within public institutions, but also to identify champions within those institutions. We did training of grassroots and community-based organizations, produced materials, IC materials in the form of posters, flyers, stickers, all of them encouraging people to get involved. Also targeted trade unions and professional associations across the country to engage the process. Used religious groups and bodies, faith-based organizations. Indeed, we got priests and imams to preach freedom of information in the course of their sermons in church or in the mosque, because they also have a constituency that we needed to reach, and their word is usually taken as gospel truth, so they were very important for us. And they also provided justification for access to information drawn from religious texts like the Bible and the Quran, as well as religious history about how God supports good governance, equity, justice, and so on. We engaged the business community, both the organized private sector and the informal sector, which is organized around a national association of traders, and built partnership with some government institutions like the anti-corruption agencies, which were natural partners, and also through them tried to gain more inroads into government. Since 2000, September 2000, we had set up a broad-based coalition with members from NGOs, faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, religious bodies, and so on, virtually across the country. And by the time the bill was passed, we had over 200 such organizations that were members of this coalition, doing various things to get the message across. So just moving into the last part of my presentation, which is the success stories and lessons learned. I forgot when I was moderating Henry yesterday that he was going to be moderating me today. I now regret giving you a deadline yesterday. I'll try and do it in 2 minutes. Now, civil society organizations faced a major challenge of capacity in advocating on behalf of the bill. One was that very few people had good advocacy skills. So although we had a broad coalition, the truth was only very few people within that coalition could effectively do advocacy. Secondly, a lot of us were good at shouting slogans past the Freedom of Information Bill, but many of us did not even read the bill. So we really didn't have good understanding of the issues, and therefore we're not able to engage in arguments with public officials or with parliamentarians about the provisions in the bill. And there was a lot of misinformation coming out of government, which some of these advocates found difficult to engage because they hadn't read the bill themselves. The use of media was extremely successful because the issue became firmly ingrained in the public consciousness, and the freedom of information movement at some point took a life of its own. We really didn't have to try and direct that. At some point, everybody started talking about it, and parliamentarians found themselves being asked everywhere, why have you not passed the Freedom of Information Bill? We had some strategy planning sessions, which I think enhanced a sense of joint ownership within the public and civil society, and also sort of ensured better understanding among advocates about the issues, and resulted in some consistency in messaging. I have fairly detailed suggestions around the SMS, but given the lack of time, I would leave that. I think the training for information officers in government institutions was also very helpful, very useful, both in creating the awareness within them, but also in providing us a vehicle through which we could access their bosses. When they became believers, they were able to facilitate meetings for us with higher officials. And I think the final thing I would say, although it's not the final point in my presentation, is that it's good for us to run a very high-profile campaign, as I sense that we're planning to do in Namibia. But that alone is not going to be sufficient to deliver success at the end of the day. Whilst you keep the issue very visible, very high-profile, we also need to run a campaign at a lower level, at a nitty-gritty level, where people are following the processes, details of the processes, whether the bill moves from one stage to the other. Sometimes we forget those and focus on the broader campaign, which really does not help that kind of progression through the various stages. And I think it's very important to have people who are focused on that, very stuck in the parliament and seeing how the campaign is moving and how the processes are developing, and also reading the text of the law, understanding it, and rereading it at every stage, because as the process evolves, the text of the law would change. And if you think you're still talking about the original text that went into the process, you may find that you are misleading people, or you are just no longer on top of your issue. So we need constantly to read the text as the process evolves and monitor changes that are introduced and be able to assess compliance by those changes with the relevant standards and principles of access to information. Hopefully, when we discuss, I may be able to speak to some other points. Thank you very much.
Yeah, big brothers have issues, but we accept them. We cannot reverse the process. I think why I'm giving Nigeria a lot of that time is that they managed to sustain the campaign. And then I think the critical thing is to think they survived the process through 3 presidents. So you must understand that while it looks perhaps easy for Liberia, that with perhaps 4 years and then one government, it's delivered in another country, it took 3 different presidents. One of them sat on the law when it had been passed all along. That's something he hasn't said. So they had to start with a new person being in the office. I would now begin coming back from West Africa so that I can spare Professor. He will speak last, being the professor on the panel. I would also want to point out that we know that Zambia and Malawi are not starting this process. They've been at it for some time, and including Botswana. So what I just want to find out, I think, from the Honorable MP from Botswana, what do you see being the place for real MPs to take this leadership? Because why we are in all this discussion is that sometimes MPs whose primary role is to pass laws get there and do not pass such laws. What is the place of an MP in Botswana in changing this dynamic?
Thank you very much. I'm a member of parliament from Botswana. I think those who are familiar with the politics of the region would know that Botswana normally has a number of things it boasts about, being the oldest democracy in the continent and all that. But on this particular issue, we are clearly dwarfed by a number of other countries in terms of the progress they have made. What has happened in the case of Botswana is that in 1996, Botswana adopted what we called the long-term vision for Botswana, Vision 2016. By 2016, Botswana would have been independent for 50 years. So this vision more or less encapsulates what the sort of society would like to see when we turn 50. And within that vision was the promise or the pledge by government to adopt a freedom of information law so as to try and promote what we called a more informed society. That was 1996 when the pledge was made. In 2007, realizing that we haven't really moved after 11 years, I at the time posed a question in Parliament and just asking the minister to state when they plan to introduce the freedom of information law. And basically, let me just read out the question and answer quickly. It's not a long one. It simply states, if the minister will consider introducing a Freedom of Information Act, if there is such a consideration, when she expects to table such a law. And this is the response in 2007. Honorable Speaker, I have no plans to introduce a Freedom of Information Act. I am convinced that the actions I have taken to date are adequate to improve the flow of information between government and the public. As the honorable member is aware, consultation on broadcasting policy is ongoing. The mass media bill and the cybercrime bill will soon be ready for cabinet and later parliament for consideration. The existence of the Media Advisory Council, which is a subcommittee of the high-level consultative council, ensures consultation between government and the media. In addition, Mr. Speaker, government is in the process of establishing a new Botswana Government Communications Information Services Unit within the Office of the President. All these actions are intended to improve the flow of information from government to both domestic and international audiences. I am convinced that a combination of all these activities will to a very large extent be in keeping with the principles enshrined in the Freedom of Information laws wherever they exist. I thank you. That obviously was a major drawback. But I think what you also need to understand and should not take lightly is that there could actually be a genuine conceptual problem in terms of understanding really what freedom of information is. And that government PR exercises cannot substitute the right to access information. However, later in the years, specifically in 2010, that was 3 years later, I then tabled a motion in Parliament in terms of the standing orders. As a private member, you can't just bring a bill. You first need to get permission from the House. So permission was granted. And I must say with overwhelming support from both sides of the House. I'm from the opposition, but the entire ruling party at the time supported the request for introduction of the law. And in November of 2011, a year later, the first draft of the law was gazetted, and we had a number of consultative meetings. We had set up a small group under MISA Botswana chapter, which included a number of civil society players, law society, the trade unions, and political parties. And we had a number of meetings where we were going through basically the draft, and we seemed to have sufficient buy-in. Not only sufficient, actually, I think it's an understatement, overwhelming buy-in, because there was really no opposition to the bill. I think the missing link in that consultative process, with the benefit of hindsight, was to leave out top civil servants. We normally just think that if the politicians agree, it's likely to pass. But I think in the case of Botswana, it was clear that the senior civil service had a major problem, and they mounted their own campaign to now advise the ministers against the bill. So on the day when the bill came up for debate in Parliament early this year, a note circulated, well, a document circulated just before the debate started, asking members not to pass the bill, and it came from the office of the president, leading to the debate being adjourned to allow for further consultations. And in the further consultations, it became clear that there was the total change of heart on the side of the executive. Because no matter how you tried to address their concerns and propose amendments to the draft, when you meet them next, they would have a fresh list of complaints on why the law ought not to pass, leading ultimately to a vote on the floor of Parliament. All the members of opposition were voting for it, and only one ruling party member voting for it. We don't know who that was up until now, because it's a secret ballot in Parliament. But the key debate was around the issues of exemptions. There was a demand to try and have some long list or some list of public bodies that ought to enjoy blanket exemption. But so it was areas where it was difficult to try and really compromise, because it then really defeats the objective of accountability. It would be to concede that certain public bodies would never have the obligation to account to the public. But going forward, I think what we have now seen in Botswana is that, at least at the moment, even at the moment, by the way, the bill was only killed through the vote last week, Thursday. So the debate is still going on nationwide about whether or not we should have passed the bill. Government has said it will bring its own draft because they were uncomfortable with the draft as presented. Obviously, within the political circles, sometimes it matters whether the bill came from a ruling party MP or from the opposition. The plan is to keep the pressure, to maintain some campaign around it. I must say that the media came to the game quite late, in my view. Just when they realized that it may not pass, they got into some relaxation mode when it seemed that there was some, like I say, overwhelming consensus around it. Only when they realized that there's been a change of heart did they come to the party. And some of them came to the party without familiarizing themselves with the details of the law. It was like in the case of Nigeria, passed the law, but when you really thought they will counter some of the arguments that were being presented by those opposed to it, they fell far short of that. So we plan to keep the campaign going. I was actually thinking of a one-year plan, but when you hear of other countries saying it's been 10 years, oh my, I wonder if we will be able to sustain that. But at least we are going back to the drawing boards to come up with at least a one-year plan. The minister is committed to tabling his draft within the first quarter of next year. That gives us enough time to maintain the pressure. My view is that we need to also try and improve on the draft that we had. You'll never get a perfect law, and some of the criticism was fair, so you could improve on it and use it to pressurize the minister to come with his draft so that we can then start working on it. In the event he decides not to table any draft, we will retable the current draft that has been rejected. It's around about June, July of next year. Then I think the arguments against would have been more or less defeated if we maintain the campaign. So I hope it won't be as long, also because, like I say, government basically committed to having the law in place before 2016. Next year is 2013, which leaves us with only 3 years. So the clock is ticking, and that may work in favor. But I think as a final parting shot, we do have, for example, the draft AU law, which was very helpful in improving the draft we had in Botswana. But I think there is need for a more regional focused strategy of how you help countries to put up a credible and sustainable campaign around freedom of information. You know, I know one of the accusations was that we plagiarized, we stole this draft from somewhere else. But that really is the purpose of a model law It's to have it run around, and anyone who wants to grab a piece of it to do that. But I think we really do need a more focused regional campaign that will build into the continental campaign around FOI. I thank you for listening to the depressing presentation.
Thank you so much. I think the MP clearly tells us that opposition MPs have a role. However few they might be in Parliament, they still have a role. I think the Southern African region has the dominant liberation parties in power. And then the lesson we need to learn is when they are not moving, how else do we move? And I think that's what the lesson we can begin to draw from Botswana. I know that Zambia has been at this for 1991. I think that was the first time there were discussions on such a law. And then what I would like Jen to do is not to go through the paces of what they've done. I think Jen and Obrem in Malawi, the question is, what do you see as the opportunities to move this process forward? So don't get back into the history of what you've gone through. It's been long, but we can draw some lessons and then see what the opportunities can do.
Thank you very much, Henry. I had prepared this presentation the whole night, so now it's gone to waste. Wow. And I noticed that when people get to the podium, they hold it like this. I was practicing to do all that. Yes. But now he's telling me I should just talk about one teeny bit. Okay, for Zambia, like he said, I think the whole process started in 1991, and fast forwarded to 2001, 10 years after multi-party democracy came into being in Zambia. In 2001, that's when the ATI bill was drafted, but it was withdrawn, of course. And then now we have a new government again that has come in, a new political party, and this party seems to be promising to pass the law. Basically, they came into government in September last year, and so far they have instituted the process for the review of the Constitution. Several times it has happened, but this time, because the process of starting this has been within a short period of time, we still have some hope. And then this year, in April, the new government appointed a committee on access to information comprising MISA Zambia, Transparency International Zambia, several other civil society organizations, and some government officials to redraft the 2007 Access to Information Bill. And so we do see an opportunity, because there have been several pronouncements by government that they are willing to enact this law. The particular political party that is now the government is a political party that we used to work with when it was in the opposition to speak on issues around access to information. So when I see Honorable MP here talking about these things, we also had a similar member of parliament who was also the chairperson for APNAC, who would speak on our behalf in Parliament as regards issues to do with access to information, how it is important. And his party is now the one that is in government. And so we've seen the kind of movement that is not even compared to the party that brought in democracy. So I think for us, it's really an opportunity that we'd like to seize. But I think, like the others have been mentioning, we have to really be cautious and be able to watch what is really going on and not really slow down the pressure. So that is what I would say. Yeah, thanks.
We'll go to Malawi. Prof, you will talk about international leverage. You know, people sometimes are sticking to their countries as much. I know that you and me, Ghana and Kenya have been in the process, but they've not delivered the law. But what do we do to leverage on the international spaces? But Aubrey, again, the opportunity. We know the paces. Yes. We know the promise from the former president. We know the promise the new president has given. What opportunity do we see before the main elections?
I'll take a maximum of 5 minutes. Maybe even 4 or 3. But I think, for starters, maybe it's important to know that Malawi is one of the countries that has an ATI draft bill gathering dust for 8 years now. since the campaign was launched in 2004. Clear there? Fine, yes. Now, I'll just briefly talk about the rationale, then the lessons for Namibia, and of course, the opportunities, as you put it. Malawi's campaign on ATI hinges on both local and international instruments. Locally, it hinges on Section 37 of the Constitution. It's very clear. It says, subject to an act of parliament, every person shall have the right of access to all information held by the state or any of its organs at any level of government, insofar as such information is required for the exercise of his right. This is the basis for our campaign. And I know Malawi is one of the few countries in Southern Africa that has this provision in its constitution. And with this provision alone, I think government would have been willing to provide information, or people would have actually been able to ask, request information. But unfortunately, that is not the case. And that is the basis for our campaign. And I know other people actually argue that we can even test Section 37 of the Constitution to see if the courts can actually uphold it, or if they would say, no, we need a legislation to support that particular section. Now, I've said we started this 2004. That's a long time back. What are the challenges that we've experienced so far? We've actually done what we thought was the best, until government about 2 years ago, that's 5 years after the campaign, said, no, you jumped the gun. You needed to actually have an ATI policy, to accompany a bill, instead of having a bill before a policy. And I think that's an area that Namibia can actually learn from. How it's probably to do a thorough research of the processes that are there before you actually take the first step. Now, where are we now? We've developed a draft policy to support that particular legislation with support from OSISA, and we've engaged a number of partners, including MPs. We even organized a trip for MPs at some point to South Africa to appreciate how ATI is implemented, but that, unfortunately, never worked. Now, we're very optimistic at the moment that we will have an ATI legislation, probably early next year or mid next year. Why am I saying that? We currently have the political will that was lacking between 2004 and 2012. I know Henley said, no, your president, we heard she actually openly, said it. Yes, she did ask the Minister of Information to actually fast track the whole process. That's why we're very optimistic that we will definitely have an ATI legislation by mid next year. And secondly, between 2004 and 2011, the campaign was actually led by CSOs. But now we've actually lobbied the Minister of Information to take the lead, so that eventually government must not take us back again to say, you did not do A, B, C, D. So we're very sure that with the Ministry of Information in the lead, things will work. And since 2009, we've actually been campaigning for ATI from thematic areas. And I think that is also very important. And that's another area that Namibia can probably learn from. MISA Malawi at the moment is actually coordinating the campaign in Malawi and putting other partners in the forefront to ensure that we change the perception that is there, that ATI is actually about the media. We want to change that perception, because that's actually a key area why the process has been dragging in most African countries. And the other reason why we're optimistic is because of the speed with which the ATI policy document was produced. We're looking at the bill taking 5 years, more than 5 years, the campaign itself. But with the ministry in the lead, with the pressure that we were actually putting, it took about 3-4 months to produce the draft ATI policy document and refine it, and now it is ready. So we believe that with that in place, definitely Malawi, we'll have an ATI law next year. Thanks.
Thanks. I know that Kwame, when the Carter Foundation came to Ghana, MOOCs and others had the Attorney General promising the same. So, but we still don't have the law. But Ghana, I think why I give Professor this session is he runs Media Foundation for West Africa, which has directly or indirectly had input in a number of these successful country cases, but how to link up and tap onto the international experience is a necessary thing. So, Prof.
Thank you. Before I go on, let me just say that Ghana, our big brother in the region, naturally and politically, is Nigeria. And Ghana has tended to follow Nigeria's steps. In that, as of today, we are also traversing 3 presidents, and like Nigeria, one is dead. Yes, the question, the whole question of the international aspect you are raising is very important on so many counts. First of all, as Pansy said yesterday, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights